File into the bunker and take your seats. The broadcast is about to begin. From Fort Bragg, North Carolina, this is the Doomsday Clock. Stories from the brink of Armageddon. Brought to you by the 18th Airborne Corps.
Hey there, it's Joe Buccino. Welcome back to the Doomsday Clock podcast. Thanks for listening. I always want to start this with a upbeat intro, but it's such a gloomy, dark music bed, and it is called Doomsday Clock, so perhaps we should be a little bit more grim in introducing these episodes. This one in particular is a very dark set of stories. We've got Fred Kaplan. Fred Kaplan is the national security columnist for Slate. You probably know him from that. You probably know him from The Bomb. That's his book from last year, The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. He's one of our bigger thinkers, bigger writers on the bomb, on nuclear warfare, on the Cold War, on the arms race. He's also written about cyber war. That was his book prior to that, Dark Territory, The Secret History of Cyber War. He wrote a book about David Petraeus. But we are talking primarily about his first book, The Wizards of Armageddon, which he wrote in 1983, and his last book, The Bomb. Wizards of Armageddon, that's a book that I read before I came in the Army. I read that in the mid-90s, is about the development and the growth of RAND, the RAND Corporation, after World War II, and how it shaped policies around nuclear war and the nuclear arms race. The Bomb is in some ways a sequel. It's more about the elected officials, the military leaders who adjudicated the strategies that were advised by the RAND Corporation. Together, it's a lot of information. These are fascinating books. He spent 10 years writing The Bomb, and he uncovered a lot of material, declassified a lot of material, spoke with hundreds of people. And so it really picks up where the Wizards of Armageddon left off. So it took many weeks, about 6 weeks, to put this together. Fred Kaplan wanted to do it. His people wanted to do it. We were able to get it done, and really just excited to talk to him. Looking forward to the conversation. We're going to bring him in now, and thanks for listening. Here is, very soon, Fred Kaplan. I should mention that Fred has a PhD from MIT. His book about Petraeus was called The Insurgents. That was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Very prolific writer, very thoughtful guy, and he's somebody who is very influential in national security circles, in the Beltway, the Pentagon, and among people who make policy. So let's bring him on and look forward to this discussion. Fred, thanks so much for joining us. Just really honored to have you on the show and talk about the Cold War and nuclear war and all the things that it indicates and all the things that it means for us.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me.
You jokingly asked why the Airborne was interested in nuclear war, and of course for us it's about the history and what we can be gleaned from history, and it's about, the application of land power to these ideas and also to the thinking about national security.
Sure. That's
what we do on this show. So, I was telling my producer here, Wizards of Armageddon, I read that before I came in the Army. That's your first book, 1983.
Right.
The Bomb is your last book, at least your most recent, and today, the day that we're recording this, the paperback edition is out. I think the connective tissue to these, of course, is the nuclear bomb. And I think, if we start this discussion shortly after World War II, there's a period where the bomb became, for some thinkers and then for some leaders, it became the centerpiece of national security strategy. And over time, and pretty quickly, it almost, in my mind, almost becomes a religion. It becomes just an unfillable hole that you can't have enough, there is never enough, and there's no satiating the demand for the bomb. How did this all come to be?
Yeah. Well, this isn't ancient history either. I mean, the bomb was the centerpiece of American military policy really well into the 70s. Mm-hmm. What happened? World War II ended with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During the war, air power was becoming more important. There were a group of theorists, even since World War I, who thought that air power could replace everything in warfare. And the atomic bomb, which was so much more powerful than conventional bombs, seemed to affirm this theory. And so after the war, right after the war, well, there were two things that going on, one in a military sphere, one in a civilian sphere. And in the military sphere, there was a big argument between the Air Force and the Navy. And the Air Force, of course, became an independent service in 1947 over whether the bulk of U.S. defense budget should go for bomber aircraft, which could drop atom bombs, or for large aircraft carriers. And there was a huge, it was called the Revolt of the Admirals, the big revolt against the bomb. And their arguments got a little bit silly even. I mean, on the one hand, you had admirals testifying that the bomb was gruesome and immoral and it killed people and it was against our ethos and against law. And yet you also had admirals testifying that actually it's not really all that powerful. One admiral testified that if you stood at the end of a runway at National Airport in Washington and with nothing but a shirt on your back and set off an atom bomb on the other end, you wouldn't get hurt. Well, you know, this became kind of ridiculous because you couldn't argue on the one hand that this thing was more savage than anything in human history, and on the other hand say that if you stood a few hundred yards away, nothing would happen to you. So the Air Force basically won the argument. And nobody really wanted to spend a lot of money on ground forces. It was believed that the Soviet Union was hell-bent to, and Red China, they were seen as kind of the same thing, were hell-bent to dominate the world and all over the world. And so if you started putting army troops all over the place, wherever they might go, you would bankrupt yourself. So the bomb was the easy answer to everything. Now, in the civilian sphere, right after the war, there were a group of strategists, civilian strategists, who began to think, okay, the bomb, is this just a really big weapon, you know, like any other weapon, but just very, very large? Or does this somehow change the nature of warfare? Is this so big that, and of course this became even more so when the hydrogen bomb came about a few years later, but is this so big that you really can't reconcile it with any rational war aims? It's more destructive than any war aims. So some of these strategists, most notably a guy who was at Yale University at the time named Bernard Brodie, said that, you know, till now the point of wars is to win them, but at this point maybe the point is to avoid them, to deter them. And so they started thinking, we have to just prevent our enemies from attacking us with atomic bombs when they get them. And, you know, he came up with this idea. How do you do this? Well, you have a survivable second strike force. In other words, you have bombers or missiles or whatever carries these things, fairly invulnerable and placed so that and able to survive a first strike and then afterwards capable of launching a second strike, like retaliation in kind. And that would deter the other side. As I said, this was a notion that wasn't at all obvious before somebody said it and then became completely obvious in 1945, 46. And, you know, it still, to some extent, is the bedrock notion of nuclear deterrence today. Then the question is, how much do you need? How much is enough to be able to deter the other side from engaging in nuclear aggression?
Right, and it's never enough.
That's one thing. Well, you know, Eisenhower, who was president from 53 to 1961, and he had been, you know, a five-star Army general, right, in World War II. But he was the one who articulated this policy that became known as massive retaliation, which was, you know, basically if the Soviet Union or Red China stepped foot across the east-west border, we would retaliate with nuclear weapons. Now, Eisenhower was not, unlike someone like Curtis LeMay, he was not a particularly savage or even ruthless guy. He understood and was haunted by the destructiveness of the atom bomb. But his view was that if there is going to be a war between the U.S. and the Sino-Soviet bloc, as it was then known, and by the way, it was kind of assumed that there would be a war like this at some point, that it's going to go nuclear at some point very soon, very quickly. And that being the case, the real goal of what we had to do was to deter the Russians from attacking to begin with. And that meant, threatening to knock them out with nuclear weapons the very first thing before they, instantly. Eisenhower was even against the idea of, starting out with a conventional defense and seeing whether we could keep it at that. He thought, no, that might even lower the threshold. That might degrade deterrence because the Russians then might not think they had anything to worry about. And it was also believed at the time that their military power in Eastern Europe was just so overwhelming compared with what we had in Western Europe at the time. It's not even worth bothering. So that was the notion. And then at the end of the decade, at the end of the 50s, that was when everything was turned over to Strategic Air Command because the Navy had its Polaris submarine, at which point, by the way, destroying cities became okay in Navy doctrine, because that's about all that the Polaris missiles could do at the time. And they very much adopted the minimum deterrence notion, the idea that you deter nuclear war by threatening to destroy the other guy's cities if he attacks you. But there was a big competition between who's going to dominate, the Air Force with its bombers and later the intercontinental ballistic missiles, or the Navy with its Polaris submarines. And there was a fear that there was going to be huge overlap with this. Both services would be targeting the same things. So they came up with something called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, which still exists, the PSYOP. And it was a big PSYOP conference at Omaha, SAC headquarters, and the Air Force ended up dominating the whole thing. But basically, it was consistent with Eisenhower's massive retaliation, except it was way more massive than anybody could have imagined. This was all very top secret at the time. It became declassified much, much later. But basically, the plan in the first PSYOP, 1960, was called PSYOP 62 because it would take effect in fiscal year 62. The war plan was that if the Soviet Union or China invaded, some chunk of the free world, not if they launched their own nuclear attack, no, it's a conventional invasion of some sort, that we would unload our entire nuclear arsenal as quickly as possible at every target in the Soviet Union, Communist China, and Eastern Europe. Communist China, even if China had no direct involvement in the war. And somebody asked, how many people is this going to kill? And the calculation is that it would kill 285 million people. And that wasn't, that was excluding the effects of, for example, radioactive fallout, because they didn't have any good way of measuring that, so they just left it out of the equation. And of course, as we now know, there would be tens of not hundreds of millions of people killed by the fallout, even in Western Europe, possibly even in the United States. But that was the policy going into the Kennedy administration. There was no plan B. That was it.
Yeah, that's more than double the amount of all people killed in both world wars.
Well, I think way more than that. 280 million people we're talking about. Yeah. So, it's not even in the same ballpark. But that was the plan. The idea was we can't hold anything in reserve because they might attack that. And this was a first strike plan, by the way. This was, they attack us conventionally, we unload all the nuclear weapons right away. Nobody was going to wait around for them to attack us. There was some studies done in the mid to late 50s about the vulnerability of SAC bombers to a Soviet attack because they were all kind of medium-range bombers. They had to refuel at overseas bases that were close to the Soviet Union, and therefore the Soviet Union was close to them. And a civilian who was in charge of one of these studies presented it to General LeMay, who was the commander of SAC. He just wasn't concerned about it at all. And the guy asked him, he said, General, you seem kind of relaxed about this. He goes, look, if I get word from intelligence that the Soviets are preparing to attack us, I'm going to attack them first. And the guy said, well, that's not the policy of the United States. And he goes, I don't care. That's my policy, and that's what I'm going to do. So, that's the sort of commanders we had back then as well.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting when you talk about LeMay and you talk about this idea and you talk about even Eisenhower, and there are others like General Lemnitzer, who was the chairman under Kennedy. You tell me if I'm misreading this or if I'm wrong, but just in researching this subject and this show, it seems like our World War II generals didn't necessarily have the intellectual capacity for this new capability or for the competition it brought in. Now, there are a few exceptions. I think Jim Gavin, who's known here in Fort Bragg, is probably an exception. He understood limited warfare and unconventional warfare. Am I wrong about that?
No, I mean, a lot of it depends on what they were doing in World War II. LeMay was firebombing Japan. He was engaged in strategic bombing. Toward the end of the war, like in April, I think it was, of 1945, General Hap Arnold, the commander of U.S. forces generally, asked him, when's the war going to end? And he took the question to his staff, and they did the calculations. And he came back and said, the war will be over on September 1st. And his calculation was that was when practically every square mile of Japan would be obliterated. I mean, that was his concept of warfare in the air age, that you just bomb everything. Gavin was Army. Maxwell Taylor was Army. There were even some Air Force generals who were tactical bombers, air support, doing air support of Army troops. They had a very different idea. They had this idea of using atom bombs to attack discrete targets. And LeMay just thought that was an enormous waste, to take something as big as an H-bomb and to use it to attack a single power plant or something like that. He just thought that was an enormous waste of technology and firepower.
So Eisenhower was also Army, but he placed all his faith, or a lot of his faith, in strategic bombing, at least when he was president.
That's right, because he thought that was just how a war was going to go. There was one conversation he had with Maxwell Taylor, who was the chief of staff of the Army at the time. And he knew Taylor, of course, from the war and everything. And Taylor was objecting to this excessive emphasis on air power. And he said, Max, listen, don't worry about it. The Army is going to play a huge role in establishing order and rebuilding on the home front after the war. That was his view. His life was in the Army. But he just thought there was not going to be any more limited. He thought maybe if there was a war in some place like Vietnam. There was even a conversation where he mentions Vietnam, and this is, of course, before the French were still involved in Vietnam at the time. He could see maybe a few battalions here and there, but if it got to be anything like the size of the Korean War, then he couldn't imagine that we would send in so many troops when we had the atom bomb in our pocket. And we would definitely use that. So that was his view. But again, he wasn't cavalier about it like LeMay. He was horrified by it, and that's why he wanted to put all his marbles on deterrence. And to him, that required the ability to just inflict massive damage. That's what you need to do to prevent the communists from aggression. That was his view.
Ultimately, the view of the generals is towards this trajectory, but it seems to me that no civil official, no president can reverse this trend, and a lot of them identify and even point out the absurdities of this. Certainly Kennedy, Nixon and Kissinger, and yet they seem to be unable to do anything to stop the growth of this, or the belief in the bomb.
Yeah, well, they tried. I mean, for example, when Kennedy came in, and he brought Robert McNamara as his Secretary of Defense. And McNamara, he worked under LeMay during World War II. He'd done statistics. How many planes do you need to get from here to there in X number of time and so forth. Then he'd organized Ford Motor Company under systems analysis. So he was very quantitatively oriented. And, he was the youngest Secretary of Defense at the time, and he was a very well-educated guy. And he was briefed on the PSYOP by LeMay's successor, a general named Tommy Power, who even LeMay once described as a sadist. And Powers is giving LeMay the PSYOP briefing, and at one point there was an enormous air defense radar in Albania, and one part of the plan was to destroy that radar with several bombs because it was essential for the follow-up bombers to get through. And at one point, Power says to LeMay, well, Mr. Secretary, if you have any friends or relations in Albania, I'm afraid we're just going to have to take them out. I mean, just this kind of asinine humor, and McNamara was just fuming. And so he tried to impose on the military limited nuclear options. There was a strategist at the Rand Corporation, which was doing a lot of thinking about nuclear war in the 50s, who had come up with this idea called counterforce. And it's funny, in later days, counterforce was seen as kind of bloodthirsty, but in fact it was trying to reduce the flow of bloodthirstiness. The idea was, okay, look, we can't have this PSYOP plan for two reasons. One, again, it's just crazy destructive. And two, because of that, it's incredible. The Russians were starting to build their own nuclear weapons. Is it really a credible threat to threaten to destroy the entire Soviet Union if they can respond by destroying us? They could launch an attack on our forces and then say, we still have some weapons. If you attack us, we're going to knock off your cities. And so the threat, they saw it, massive retaliation, as A, immoral, but also B, not credible, not a credible deterrent. Nobody will really believe that you'll do this. So counterforce was kind of the reverse image of that. The idea was, okay, let's say the Soviets invade West Germany. What we do is we launch a very limited attack against the Soviet strategic rocket forces and their submarines and so forth. Basically, their ability to attack us. And then we say to them, okay, we've got a bunch of weapons left over here that you can't destroy. We have them hidden away. Surrender now, or we will unleash our attack against your cities. Now, the people who first came up with this idea, and I interviewed all of them many years ago, they didn't really quite believe that this would happen. Once you start flinging nuclear weapons, your command control communications goes to hell. You can't necessarily even communicate with your own people, much less with the other side. The intelligence, especially back then, before there were satellites and so forth, you might not even know what's going on. It's not like there are two masters looking over a chessboard. There's a lot of confusion. But their view was, if there's even a slight chance that we could limit the damage of this war before it gets out of hand, then it's worth taking this. So McNamara revised the PSYOP, and he put in place 5 limited options. Like 1, where we just attack Soviet nuclear forces, 2, Soviet and Chinese nuclear forces, 3, their conventional forces, 2. It wasn't until you got to option 5 that you blow up their cities. Now, in my first book, Wizards of Armageddon, which was published in 1983, I put that in the book, and I wrote that changed the PSYOP, because nothing was declassified about any of this stuff at the time, or at least not about McNamara's PSYOP. And I got a lot of documents on the first PSYOP declassified. I was the first one to do that, but nothing about Kennedy-McNamara's PSYOP. What I learned in writing this new book, which is much broader, called The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War, was that essentially SAC ignored McNamara's orders. You see, my sources on the first book were the people under McNamara who wrote it, and they believed that it worked, that they got the PSYOP changed. What I found out later was that basically what the Joint Chiefs would write in their guidance was, we will do X, Y, and Z, we will do these limited options if they are militarily feasible, or if they are consistent with strategic objectives. And of course, it turned later within their own councils that it wasn't militarily feasible. And it wasn't consistent with strategic objectives. And by the way, I mean, part of this was just a way to maintain control over everything. But in a way, they were probably right. It's not at all clear, even then or now, but especially back then, that you could launch just part of your nuclear weapons, and then if they fire back with an equally limited strike, that then the rest of your nuclear arsenal is still viable. And you can play this, what they call the tit-for-tat game, over several exchanges, as they were called. In some footnotes to internal documents, the SAC people would say, look, once there are some exchanges, we have no guarantee at all that we can still launch these things. Or maybe the president won't even be alive. The command authority won't even be around to launch them. And so that's one reason why their philosophy for so many years was, look, you got to unload all of them. If you're going to do this, it's got to be the whole thing. And again, these were still first strike plans. So when Nixon comes in at the end of the 60s, and Henry Kissinger is his national security advisor, and briefly, Kissinger had been a consultant to Kennedy's national security team. And they get the PSYOP briefing, and Kissinger is appalled that it's the same old PSYOP. It's the original PSYOP. There's nothing in there about options and restraint and keeping forces in reserve and that sort of thing. And he tried to change the PSYOP. And James Schlesinger, who was Nixon's Secretary of Defense, made a big push, because he also came out of Rand Corporation, which was very big on pushing these limited options. But none of it really happened until the Reagan and Bush Sr. administrations. So really, from the beginning of the atomic age until really very close to the end of the Cold War, basically for practically the entire time that people thought that a nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia was something that might happen, our plan was basically first strike, massive retaliation. That's what it was. There was a lot of stuff that secretaries of defense said to the contrary, but the actual plan was, it went back to LeMay's bomb everything.
Just maybe focus in on Kennedy a little bit here. He's interesting to me because it seems like he came into office as a real Cold Warrior and a Soviet hawk in many ways, like Eisenhower. In fact, in the run-up to his presidency, in his campaign, that this idea that this vast missile gap with the Soviets put us at risk, he gets into office, he finds out this is not true at all, not even close, not even remotely close, that we're completely outpacing the Soviets in terms of nuclear capability. And then he turns to the counterforce strategy and he starts thinking of ways to limit the bomb. So, I just wonder, it's one of the great sort of what-ifs of American history. Had he lived out a full term and then was reelected, which, what trajectory are we on, or where do we end up with all this if he lived?
It's a very good question. I've done a lot of looking into this, and this is also basically since The Wizards of Armageddon. When The Wizards of Armageddon was published in 1983, there was almost nothing declassified about what Kennedy personally said, did, or thought about nuclear weapons. By the time I wrote The Bomb, there was a lot of stuff. And it's fascinating because you're right, he came into office, he believed the stuff about a missile gap, which, by the way, Air Force intelligence had been pushing because, if the Soviets have a lot of missiles, that means we need to buy a lot of missiles. And in 1959, the CIA started coming up with very different projections of what the Russians were really up to. But the CIA estimates were never briefed to Congress. Eisenhower kept it secret. Eisenhower said, no, there's no missile gap, and people thought that he was naive. The photo reconnaissance satellites were starting to come online at that point. And, there were projections that the Soviets would have like 500 ICBMs by the early 60s. It turned out they had 4. Not 400, 4. So Kennedy comes in and he realizes this. And then he realizes a few other things. There's a transcript of a meeting that he had just a few days after he was president, and he's meeting with the Joint Chiefs. And he's saying, I'm going to consult with you a lot. I want to meet with you regularly. You're going to be the first people I talk to. I mean, remember, Kennedy was a lieutenant in World War II. Someone like Arleigh Burke, the chief of naval operations, these guys were heroes of World War II. 41 Knot Burke. I mean, these were people who were generals and admirals during the war. LeMay was chief of staff of the Air Force. So he looked up to these guys. And then a few things happened. First, there was a crisis in Laos. And guess what? The Army was recommending an invasion, the Navy was recommending strikes from aircraft carriers, and the Air Force was recommending aerial bombing, including nuclear. And he begins to realize, this seems to be like a bureaucracy. And he settles the crisis diplomatically. Then I want to talk a little bit about the Berlin crisis of 1961, because it's often overshadowed by the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later.
Yeah, please.
But Berlin, just a lot of people who are listening to this might be too young to remember.
Yeah.
But after World War II, Berlin, which was in the heart of what became East Germany, like 100 miles into East Germany, but it was divided into a western sector, which was controlled by us, and an eastern sector, which was controlled by the Soviet Union. A few times, Khrushchev threatened to just take over West Germany. We're going to end World War II, as he put it. This is our territory. It's going to become ours. And he backed off for various reasons. But in 1961, it was going to get serious. He told Kennedy when they met in Vienna in the spring that we're going to just sign a treaty and just declare that West Berlin is ours, and if you try to resist, there will be war. And so there were a lot of meetings, and there are a lot of transcripts and records of these meetings where it was discussed. What happens if they actually do this? What do we do? And they came up, with a 4-phase prong, which was, the first, we'll send in a company of troops. If they still come, we'll send in a battalion or brigade, I forget, brigade, I think. Then third, we'll have a UN resolution and we'll send aircraft overhead and we'll do a blockade. And then phase 4 was nuclear. Again, we didn't have very many troops in Western Europe, and even if we did, retaking West Berlin would involve first invading 100 miles of East Germany. And there were tanks, Soviet tank divisions all along the border. So we're going to use nuclear weapons. And they divided that into, there's 4A, B, and C. A, we just do a demonstration attack. It doesn't matter even where. Just throw up a couple of nukes to show that we're serious and hope that makes the Soviets tremble and back off. 4B, tactical nuclear weapons. We had a lot of them in Europe at the time, thousands. Actually used nukes to destroy Soviet military gatherings. And then 4C, general war, which was this all-out, psyop. Just bomb everything. So Kennedy was looking for alternatives. The guy who came up with this counterforce idea, Bill Kaufman at RAND, he was now a consultant in the Pentagon. He discovered that there was no missile gap. And not only no missile gap, but the Soviets were weak in a lot of areas. Their air defense radar was no good. The bombers weren't even loaded with bombs on the runways. And he came up with an idea. He goes, this limited nuclear attack that I came up with, the idea as the first phase of a counterforce attack, we might be able to actually do this. And so there was a 36-page study done. It was like a military campaign. How could we pull off this first strike? And they figured, we could. It would require 44 bombers carrying 88 bombs, could destroy the entire Soviet strategic force. Now, I did have a few pages on this in The Wizards of Armageddon, because some people told me about this back then. Since that time, all of these documents have been declassified. Some of my requests, some of the other people's requests, the 36-page study, memos back and forth within the Joint Chiefs talking about this. Kennedy was briefed on it. He had questions about it that he actually wrote himself. There were meetings. But then Kennedy, there was fine print in this 36-page report which was if a few Soviet weapons survived this attack and if they retaliated, up to several million Americans could die. Certainly, a couple million Europeans would die. And, a person who many years later, Bill Kaufman, who was involved in this memo, he told me that, before he told me that there was this study, he once said, I was a student of his in graduate school at MIT. Mm-hmm. He said, I once witnessed a test of whether there was any such thing as strategic superiority, and it turned out there wasn't. Because in 1961, if there was any time in history that one side or the other had strategic superiority, this was it. And yet Kennedy decided, no, this is still going to be a bloodbath. This is not worth it. And so he did something very interesting. He decided to have the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Roswell Gilpatrick, give a speech in which he revealed that we knew that the missile gap was nonsense. And by the way, Khrushchev was also one reason why there was a missile gap. Khrushchev had been bluffing. His ICBM program was a disaster, but he was giving speeches saying we're churning out ICBMs like sausages. And so the idea was, okay, we're going to tell Khrushchev that we know that it's nonsense, that he has nothing. And it was a speech, an amazing speech, where he's giving numbers, how many we have, how many they have. Even if they launched the first strike, we would have more than they did. We would be able to answer any question. We would be able to deal with everything. And therefore, the implicit message to Khrushchev was, you're trying to make us believe that you have a nuclear backup to a threat on West Berlin, and therefore we won't answer you. But we know that your backup is a bluff, so lay off. So that is why Khrushchev backed off Berlin. But then what happened? This is what led directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Khrushchev, who really did believe that the United States was planning to launch a first strike on the Soviet Union, that's one reason why he put up this bluff, though now we'll clobber you back if you ever do this. He suddenly realizes that we know he's got nothing. And so he decides, okay, until the ICBM program starts going well, I need to do something as an interim measure. So what does he do? He puts medium and intermediate range missiles in Cuba, which can hit the United States, which is the same as having some ICBMs in the Soviet Union that could hit the United States. It was a measure of a compensation for what everybody now saw was a weakness. So that's the origins of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then if you'll just let me go on for a little bit, because this is where it gets really interesting with Kennedy. Yeah. There's a lot of myths about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
They had 13 days of sessions. Kennedy taped them with nobody else but he and his brother Bobby, who disagreed vastly on what they should do, but they're the only ones who knew they were being taped. These tapes have been in the public for more than 25 years now, and yet I can count on one hand the number of accounts of the Cuban Missile Crisis that draw on these tapes. Here's what the tapes show. First, they wonder what we're going to do, and then McNamara comes up with this idea of blockading Cuba, which they do, and that part is well known. But then the myth is that, we go eyeball to eyeball with the Russians, and the Russians blink, and they agree to pull them out, and it's completely because we laid down the law of what they had to do. That's not what happened. On the last day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, on the next to last day, Khrushchev puts out a proposal. He says, promise that you'll never invade Cuba, and I'll take out the missiles. And they're about to take it, but then on Saturday morning, the last day of the crisis, Khrushchev writes a telegram. There was before the hotline. They were communicating with telegrams that took 24 hours to even get to where they were going. Mm. And he releases this telegram publicly. And it says, okay, no, look, we'll take our missiles out of Cuba, but you've got to take your missiles out of Turkey. We had just begun to install IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles, in Turkey, which were as far away from the southern border of Russia as the missiles in Cuba were to the southern border of the United States. Now, Kennedy sees this as a great deal. He says, well, this seems like a fair trade. Any man at the UN would look at this and think this is a fair trade. And suddenly everybody in the room goes nuts. There's been this notion of there's the hawks and the doves in the ex-con meetings. He had these meetings for 13 days with all of his advisors sitting around a table, very top secret. It's not true. On the last day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was John Kennedy and there was everybody else. Everybody else was adamantly opposed to this. It would humiliate the Turks. It would wreck NATO. It would damage our credibility. And then Kennedy, he lets them talk for a while, and he says, well, listen, I'm just thinking, the plan at the time was that on Monday, 2 days hence, they're going to start bombing the missile sites, not with nuclear weapons, but with conventional weapons, 500 sorties a day. And then after 5 days of this, we were going to invade Cuba. And Kennedy says, I'm just thinking ahead, 500 sorties a day, followed by an invasion, and then, that'll make the Russians take Berlin, and then we're in World War III, and this gets out. People are going to look at this proposal and say, we should have taken this deal. That is not going to be a good war. Anyway, they keep objecting. So finally, Kennedy leaves, and he gets his brother Robert, who, by the way, contrary to a lot of what was said about Robert much later, and contrary to his own evolved thinking, he was really very much a hawk. He wanted to attack the missile silos along with everybody else. The missile sites, they weren't silos. And he tells Bobby, go to the Soviet ambassador, tell him we'll take the deal, but they can't say anything about it, otherwise it's off. And he brings 7 people into the Oval Office, and he tells them what he's doing. And he says, but never tell anybody. And one of the 7 people that he did not tell was his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. So after Kennedy is killed, Johnson goes into the Vietnam War and other conflicts looking back on the Cuban Missile Crisis and thinking that the way that you deal with anything is through force, not through diplomacy. And in fact, McGeorge Bundy, he wrote his memoirs, and by that time the tapes had been declassified, and everybody knew not every historian apparently, but it's now been known what happened. And it's kind of poignant. Bundy says in his book that it's regrettable, it's tragic, that we kept up this myth that it was only force and threats that settled the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that it led to a lot of false lessons that led to tragedies later, and he was referring specifically to the Vietnam War. So, this is an incredible lesson that should be taken and that is still not completely understood. And then you asked what would happen if Kennedy hadn't been killed. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, something really interesting happens. It turns out that both Kennedy and Khrushchev were relieved that this thing got settled. Khrushchev realized he'd made a horrible mistake, a horrible miscalculation. And all of a sudden, there's some interesting wins going on. Kennedy gave a speech in June of 1963 at the American University, where he's basically calling for an end to the Cold War. He realizes from the 2 crises that he's just barely gotten into and just barely got out of, that this nuclear thing is just too dangerous, and there are no good options on how to use them. And yet this is all we're going to be left with if there's a war. So we have to end the Cold War. And he proposed in this speech, and it's really quite a beautiful speech, a limited test ban treaty. He proposed setting up a hotline. Okay, this speech was translated in all the major Soviet newspapers, Pravda, Izvestia. They lifted the jammers on Radio Free Europe and Voice of America so that people could listen to this speech. Khrushchev told the U.S. ambassador that it was the greatest speech by an American president since Franklin Roosevelt. And he started responding. A limited test ban treaty was signed. There were all kinds of things. Khrushchev started introducing measures for reciprocal unilateral reductions of troops in Europe. And then Kennedy was assassinated, and then not long after that, Khrushchev was ousted by hardliners in part for his what was called harebrained schemes, mainly over Cuba. So I do think that if Kennedy had not been assassinated, I think it's very possible that détente might have come much earlier. I think it's also very possible that Kennedy would not have sent so many troops into Vietnam. He was always very skeptical about. He'd been in Vietnam as a younger man when the French were still there, and was told by a French general, never get involved here, it's a nightmare. And one thing that he had learned in his brief time as president was that his advisors, military and civilian, whom he had so looked up to at the beginning, weren't always right about everything, and that he had to think through these things on his own. And, you know, even when he was president, there were advisors in Vietnam, and there was a steadily thinning line between advisors and combat troops, but he never sent any combat troops to Vietnam. So I think the assassination of Kennedy, there was a historian, Crane Brenton, who wrote that big doors sometimes swing on small hinges. And I think the assassination of Kennedy was a huge pivot in American history. And had it gone another way, I think the world that subsequently evolved would have been very different.
Yeah, the Cuban Missile Crisis story is fascinating from a lot of different ways. First of all, you would think that Kennedy would want his vice president, LBJ, to be aware of this deal in the event that he was somehow incapacitated and LBJ has to assume the resolution of this crisis or the resumption of this crisis. Second of all, you know, LBJ obviously takes away from this that the way to deal with communism is show resolve. And ultimately, the communist power will back off. Perhaps that's one thing he took away. But, you know, one thing, I think I read this in your book, or I heard you talk about it, is that at a certain point in there, I guess after this was resolved, Eisenhower is quietly retired, calls Kennedy, and I don't know if he confronted him, but he certainly asked him if you brokered this deal, and I think Kennedy denied it.
Yeah, this deal, you have to keep in mind the politics at the time. If it was known that Kennedy took a deal, a backdoor deal with Khrushchev, it would be denounced as appeasement and so forth. So he wanted to keep this very secret. And in fact, the myth that came out that, no, it was all pressure, and that was created and perpetuated by Kennedy himself. The sources of these myths were the two books about Kennedy written by his two aides, Ted Sorensen and Arthur Schlesinger, and that's what he told them. He wanted it to be known that he didn't want it to be known that he had caved. So not caved, but that struck a deal. So yeah, there was one. He called Eisenhower as a matter of courtesy to tell him that the crisis had been settled. And Eisenhower asked him, was there some kind of backroom deal? And, you know, at the time, if he had told them the deal, I think Eisenhower would have kept that a secret. He was a very discreet man. You know, he kept the fact that there was no missile crisis a secret. And Kennedy said, no, he called him general. He said, no, general, no, there was no deal. So he lied to Eisenhower about there was no deal. In fact, it's interesting, I mentioned Bundy's remark in the posthumous memoir. When he started writing his memoir, which goes way back to the time that he was serving in various capacities, even in World War II, he got word that there were tapes. Nobody even knew that there were tapes, and that they were going to be declassified. It was being reviewed for declassification. And they let the Kennedy Library, where they were stored, let Bundy listen to these tapes to help him research the book. And that's when Bundy realized, oh, God, this is going to come out. And in fact, at that point, Bundy, McNamara, and a few others, the 7 who were told, wrote a letter to Time magazine on some anniversary of the crisis, saying now it could be told there was a deal where we changed missiles in Cuba for missiles in Turkey. They did not say that all of them had opposed this deal. So that's what led Bundy, that shaped Bundy's writing of the latter part of his memoir, that he knew he had to deal with it only because he realized that this was on tape. And the kind of striking thing about this, and as a historian, you know, it's both such a break that we have something like this, but then you have to wonder, how many other stories are there about what happened and why they happened and who said what. How many other stories like this are completely fabricated because there wasn't a tape recorder in the room? There are always these, what they call epistemological questions in history. How do we know what we know? These tapes hadn't existed, or, they'd been burned at some point. Kennedy made these tapes to help him write his memoirs later. Mm-hmm. There was no Freedom of Information Act or mandatory declassification review procedures at the time, or even any ruling which said these tapes and all documents belong to the public, not to the president. He probably figured he would retire to Hyannisport, take these tapes with him, and they would help him write his memoir. He had no notion that these tapes would ever become public. It's a curious thing, and if these tapes had not existed or had not been discovered, we would still be going on what was written in Ted Sorensen's book about what happened, which Sorensen admitted to me much later when I was writing about this, that it was nonsense. And even Robert Kennedy's book, posthumously published book, 13 Days, which was it was written by Sorensen based on Bobby's diaries. He was pressured by the Kennedy family to leave certain things out. So, here's a conscious effort to falsify history, even though by this perspective of today, Kennedy comes off looking great. I mean, another thing is, remember, we were going to invade the island of Cuba. We discovered many years later a couple of things. Some of those missiles in Cuba already had warheads on them. Mm-hmm. What if they would have launched some of them on warning? It also turns out the Russians had secretly placed about 40,000 troops on the island of Cuba to stave off an American invasion if one happened. So if we'd invaded, we definitely would have been at war with the Soviet Union. I mean, this was not just a theoretical thing. It's really one of the most dramatic and consequential episodes of the Cold War, and then one of the great tragedies that the aftermath was cut short by one man's bullet. And yet, I am a bit frustrated as a historian that this is so little appreciated.
I know. What's fascinating about all that is that, the Berlin crisis leads indirectly to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which leads, at least in some part, to the buildup of American forces in Vietnam,
yes,
which leads to LBJ dropping out of presidential contention, which leads to Nixon. It's like this entire period, or this Cold War, if you pull one thread, you're pulling on another element, and all of these things touch each other. The missile gap touches Vietnam. It's just, it's bizarre, and it's also fascinating the way history works in this period.
Yeah, the other thing, getting back to the nuclear story, if you look at the charts, it was really after the Cuban Missile Crisis that the arms race as we know it really got going. Before then, we still had, you count the number of ICBMs, it was in double digits. It was only after Kennedy was killed and Khrushchev was ousted that the numbers really started getting in the hundreds and then the thousands. And, it is tragic to think that all of that might have been forestalled. There was another very interesting debate. After the missile gap was exposed as a hoax, not as a hoax, but just as a myth, as something that didn't exist, there were some analysts in the White House who were saying, okay, listen, the plan was we were going to build 1,000 Minuteman ICBMs. Well, that had been based on the intelligence estimate that the Soviets would have about 1,000 by the mid-'60s. Well, it turned out they're not. They're going to have maybe half that many. And so maybe we should have half as many as well. And there was even one analyst who said, look, if we build way more than what appears to be needed or what appears that we need to match the Russians are going to think we're building up a first strike capability, and we're going to drive them to engage in an arms race, an arms acceleration as well. And McNamara's response was, well, look, 1,000, that's the fewest that I could get the Joint Chiefs to accept without rebelling. And it is true that the Air Force wanted 2,100 at the time. and they were going to raise a fit if they didn't get it. So 1,000 was a compromise. But then, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but then if you look toward the end of the 60s, you remember the MIRV was invented, the Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicle, the missile that you can put several warheads on the nose cone, and each warhead goes to a different target. By that time, the Air Force realized, okay, we'll take this 1,000 ICBM limit, but we're going to develop MIRVs. And specifically, the Minuteman III had 3 warheads on it. It ended up being 550 of those, 450 Minuteman IIs, which are single warheads. You do the math, they have 2,100 warheads on their ICBMs. So they ended up just outflanking McNamara at every turn. And again, it is true that, especially at the time, the Joint Chiefs were very powerful, and then the people who were chairing things like the Armed Services Committees in Congress paid enormous attention to the military. In fact, until McNamara came along, the military would say, these are our requirements. And there was no basis for anybody even to challenge these requirements. It was McNamara who, came in with this notion of systems analysis, looking at what you need based on your actual objectives and the costs and so forth. And, there were 3 bombers on the blueprints, and we don't need all 3. The ABM isn't going to work. There was a whole... McNamara was the first Secretary of Defense to challenge the military on everything, on budgets, on requirements, on what weapon A being better or worse than weapon B. And, over the next few years, the military decided to accommodate to this. They developed their own systems analysis. It's just, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening do analysis of what weapons requirements and so forth. Everybody learns how to do this. And in fact, everybody knows that by altering a few assumptions here and there, you can change the conclusion. You can alter the outcome. And especially when you're dealing with something like nuclear weapons, where the scenarios are so uncertain, it's very easy to alter the assumptions to come up with different conclusions.
Yeah, so many bizarre anecdotes here, and I want to get to one in particular before we start thinking about maybe some big questions. Mm-hmm. And this is my favorite anecdote of yours. I haven't found it anywhere else, and it has to do with Ronald Reagan and aliens.
Oh, yeah.
And so I don't want to tee it up because I won't present it as
well
coherently.
So Reagan's just a fascinating guy. I was a reporter. I was a newspaper reporter covering Reagan and his defense policies at the time. So what I've learned about Reagan in retrospect is kind of startling. For one thing, it turns out he was kind of a secret nuclear abolitionist. He might have been the only person who believed that the Star Wars program, the Strategic Defense Initiative, really would have just, it was like something that would shoot down every single nuclear missile, and he will offer it to the entire world, and everybody will be safe. He kind of believed that. But he comes into office. He's very hawkish, extremely hawkish, very anti-communist, had been for decades. And he's surrounded by defense advisors. The defense budget goes up by 13%. Everything is going up. And first, a few Soviet leaders die on his watch. And then comes Gorbachev. And remember, Gorbachev presented himself as a reformer, but very few people believed it. And I was a reporter at the time as well, there was a great deal of skepticism. It was believed by many people that a reformed Soviet communism was kind of an oxymoron. There couldn't be any such thing. And in fact, by the way, this analysis might have been right, because after a few years of Gorbachev, the whole system fell apart. Mm-hmm. Probably it was incompatible. But Gorbachev comes along, and they have a summit in Geneva. It's in 85. And it starts off, and they're very, very carefully taken notes of these summits that are now declassified. And it starts off very tense. They're talking about Star Wars and imperialism and other things, and it's just not getting along. And so they decide to go take a break and go for a walk along the lake. And they duck into this cabin. And the only people in this cabin are not note takers at this point. It's just Reagan, Gorbachev, and their translators. and there's a nice fireplace, burning in there. And at one point, Reagan leans in and he says to Gorbachev, let me ask you, if the United States were invaded by aliens from outer space, would you help us? Would you come to our aid? And Gorbachev says, absolutely. And Reagan says, I feel the same about you. And they walk back into the conference room, and George Shultz, who was not at this meeting in the cabin, all of a sudden notices that these guys are laughing and chortling like they're old friends. And he's wondering what happened here. And finally, they agree on some principles of what, over a period of a few years later, became, the end of the Cold War and the beginning of serious arms reduction. And Reagan, there was another incident like this. That he gave a speech at the UN once, and there was a very interesting remark in it. He said, if we were all ever invaded by aliens from outer space, the differences and rivalries between us here on Earth would look trivial by comparison. Well, Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, wanted to delete this sentence. Reagan added it back in. It got deleted. He added it back in. He was very serious about this. And, in a way, on the one hand, yeah, it's kind of nutty. But on the other hand, when you're dealing with issues of the kind of cosmic destructiveness of nuclear weapons, maybe having a perspective from 35 million miles up, maybe that is the correct way to look at this. Maybe he had something going that was sort of poo-pooed at the time.
Yeah, I think that fictional scenario, brings to light that there's a shared humanity between us and the Soviets at root. And if that humanity, if civilization is placed at risk, we would join together. And therefore, it makes sense to start stepping back from nuclear war and start stepping back from these nuclear arsenals.
Yeah, and as I say, I think there were a few of his advisors realized this and tried to keep it very secret, that Reagan, again, as long as there were tensions with the Soviet Union, he wouldn't unilaterally disarm, but he abhorred nuclear weapons. He abhorred their destruction. He liked the idea of a missile defense system because maybe you could prevent a nuclear war without having to threaten to murder other people in retaliation for them murdering us. Again, in some ways, another interesting thing about I'll just say this, when Reagan and Gorbachev met a year later at Reykjavik, where, remember, they almost agreed to disarm completely, and it got hung up over disagreements about the Star Wars system. But if you look at the notes of those meetings, which they've been declassified and translated as the Russian and the American notes, which are very similar, Gorbachev and Reagan, often in the room, just the two of them, spent 7 hours talking about nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy and international relations. And while some of his premises were a little batty, he very much understood the implications of his premises. I mean, this guy, I was told by advisors after making this observation that he, for a couple of months before Geneva, he spent a couple of hours every day reading briefing books on this. He was often looked upon as being, not very bright, and it's definitely true that toward the end of his administration, he probably did develop some incipient Alzheimer's, but he was actually very well briefed on the topics. And again, he took them in a direction that many of his advisors thought were not what they had in mind. But, well, what I'm trying to say is, I can't imagine Donald Trump talking about this stuff for 10 minutes, much less 7 hours. And the contrast is just extraordinary.
Yeah. We don't do politics here. We're an official Army show. But I would tell you that, the traditional narrative.
Well, but Trump is history now, so we're still talking history.
That's right. Well, the traditional narrative around Reagan is that he was, a bit of a simpleton who relied on his instinct and had these remarkably honed instincts, and he was generally not informed, and that's not true.
Yeah, it's not true. And I was The same is true of Eisenhower, by the way. Eisenhower would sometimes pretend to be a simpleton in press conferences and so forth. And again, as I said, I was a practicing journalist. At the time of Reagan was in office, I was the defense reporter for the Boston Globe. And reading back on, what's in the archives on Reagan really kind of made my head spin.
Yeah. Well, let's zoom out here and some things that our audience can take away from all this and maybe some larger theoretical ideas. One of the questions that we bat around here on the show, pretty straightforward. Do nuclear weapons make us safer? I think, obviously, the argument is we haven't used these in war in more than 75 years. We've been building them up. And, I do think that if you go back to 1945, 6, 7, 8, 9, 50, that if you told these leaders in the government, these thought leaders in the Rand Corporation that you write about in your first book, if you told them that we would go 75 years and never use these weapons, we'd never have a nuclear war or nuclear strike, they probably would find that hard to believe. But here we are.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. I think even someone like Daniel Ellsberg, who, was a nuclear strategist at Rand, used to be very hawkish, and then later, besides being the guy who leaked the Pentagon Papers, also became, and still is, an ardent activist for dramatic reductions in nuclear weapons. Even he acknowledges in his book on his memoir called The Doomsday Machine, nuclear weapons have probably prevented a few wars from breaking out. I think certainly India-Pakistan, I think they would have had a major war without nuclear weapons deterring them. Maybe the U.S. and the Soviet Union or Russia as well. I think the reason why we haven't had any use of nuclear weapons since 1945, I think a big part of it is, the threat of retaliation. I think it's that, but, there are some other things, and this is where things get a little scary. There have been a number of instances in history of false warnings. The radar goes off, and it looks like 150 ICBMs are coming our way. Turns out to be a flock of geese, or it turns out to be a software flaw, or something. But, if you could imagine one of these false warnings going off in the middle of a crisis, say during the Cuban Missile Crisis or something else, a president or a Soviet premier might have been tempted to respond as if it was real. And then another thing that, and this kind of surprised me a bit too, is that at least up to and including the Obama administration, there were a number of cases, more than is generally recognized, where presidents faced crises in which the use of nuclear weapons was seriously contemplated. And in all these cases, the presidents dug very deep into the issue, and they immersed themselves in the sort of the strategies and the scenarios of we do this, they do that, and so forth. And all of them came away thinking, no, this is not going to go badly. And they figured out some way to scramble out of the rabbit hole and to conclude this crisis in a peaceful way. What are the chances of, bad luck and a president or a premier who isn't so sage? That's the thing that I worry about, is the possibility of the coincidence of a crisis with some accident and looked at by someone who, doesn't feel the same way. I mean, look, the Cuban Missile Crisis, going back to that, the people sitting around that table with Kennedy were some of the smartest people who have ever been in government. And yet, if any of them had been president besides John Kennedy, we would have been at war with the Soviet Union. They were all in favor of attacking the missile sites and invading the island. And that, history isn't entirely structural. There's also a lot of contingency there. And I think there have been, while nuclear deterrence, I think, has basically prevented wars from happening there, we've also had some lucky breaks. And, it's a fair question how much longer. Let's say due to deterrence and lucky breaks, you avoid 20 nuclear wars. And then there's the 21st. And that one really happens. And, there are now studies about nuclear winter There are some estimates that if as few as 80 or 100 nuclear weapons were to go off, it could throw up enough, smoke and dust and other particulates to destroy a large amount of life on Earth. I mean, so the trade-offs are staggering. On the other hand, hey, we're stuck with these things. I don't pretend for a moment that, anytime in our lifetimes we're going to get rid of all nuclear weapons. I think short of some enormous transformation in global politics, we're going to have nuclear weapons. You look at even a country like North Korea. Nuclear weapons are all they have for leverage. They're not going to get rid of their nuclear weapons, no matter what kind of security guarantees we provide. Let's say that U.S., Russia, China, let's say we really reduce a lot of nuclear. And by the way, U.S. and Russia used to have about 30,000 nuclear weapons. We have 1/10 that number now. We've actually cut quite a bit. Let's say we got down to 1,000, 500. As long as some other countries still have nuclear weapons, we're not going to want to get into a situation of parity with North Korea or, So I think, again, short of some enormous transformation in global politics, we are stuck with these things. This guy who was my professor, Bill Kaufman, he got out of the game toward his latter years, and he used to say that when he was in the thick of it, he was like eating nuclear weapons for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Then moving away and stepping away and looking at it from afar, you realize that it's really a crazy thing, all these weird scenarios about limited nuclear war and so forth. But, the problem is that, it's crazy, and it forms a huge, I don't know if it's the centerpiece anymore, but it is a major foundation of what international politics are based on and what our policy is based on. And we're just going to have to spend quite a long time to come, I think, managing them.
Let's take a look at maybe some more news of the day. You write a column for Slate on kind of national security news items of the day. What do you think? What should our audience be thinking about here? We've got a new administration. There's some changes afoot. Certainly, we're publicly or verbally en route to re-engage with Iran on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. What do you think in terms of national security? What should we be thinking about? What should we be looking for?
Well, one of the first things that Biden did, and he did it in a phone call with Putin, which was otherwise a little contentious, as I understand. They both agreed that they would extend the New START, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, for another 5 years, which the treaty signed in 2015 by Obama and Dmitry Medvedev when he was Russian president. It allows for it. There's a clause which says the two sides may extend this for 5 years. You don't need Senate ratification anymore. So they agreed to do that. And that, I think, is a very good thing for several reasons. First, New START was fine. There was nothing wrong with New START. It actually didn't even reduce things by that much. More important, though, it created a framework for verification of the treaty, including rather intrusive inspections, requirements for notification of any movements of nuclear weapons or deployment or production. One good thing about arms control treaties, whether they reduce things substantially or not, is they bound the threat. In other words, you can have, without a treaty, you can say, okay, here's what the Russians might be able to produce over the next 5 or 10 years, and therefore we have to be prepared to also produce that many more new missiles. With a treaty in place, you can say, look, this is the most that they can produce and deploy. And we have these verification procedures. If they start breaking the treaty, we'll have plenty of notice that this is going to happen, and we can break out accordingly. So it's very good in that sense, especially while the United States and Russia are not getting along very well politically. It's even more important that we have something like this bounding the threat. In terms of Iran, it's a long story, and I'll try to make it short, but listen, the Iran nuclear deal was working. The International Atomic Energy Agency, every couple of months, they would go inspect, and they reported without fail that Iran was complying with the deal. They were really dismantling their whole nuclear structure. Before Trump withdrew from the deal, all of his advisors at the time had urged him to stay in. Most military and intelligence officers of Israel, while they had some qualms about the deal, thought that on balance it was good for Israeli security. It was really only Netanyahu who thought otherwise. If Netanyahu had been honest, the real problem that some people had with the Iran nuclear deal was that, the deal was, to put it very briefly, it was they get rid of their nuclear structure, we lift the sanctions that had been imposed because they were starting to develop nuclear weapons or what could lead to nuclear weapons. Other sanctions against their ballistic missile development and support of terrorism were and are still in place. I think the real problem that some people had with the deal was not the nuclear part. It was the part where the sanctions are lifted and Iran becomes kind of a part of the international community. There's trade. It becomes maybe even prosperous one day. That, I think, was the real issue, that Netanyahu and several other people would have rather seen a boxed-in Iran with a couple of nukes, would rather have seen that than a nuclear-free Iran that had a regional, perhaps even global presence. And I think that's an honest debate to have, but nobody wanted to have that debate. Instead, there was a dishonest one about, this deal doesn't do anything to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Well, yes, it did. And there were some complaints that some of the expiration dates were 10 years after the signing, but there were others that were 20, 25 years. It would have been in place for quite a long time. And then, the irony of this is that now people are going nuts that, Iran is breaking the deal. They're enriching more uranium than the deal allows them to. Well, if this was such a bad deal, if this was a deal that didn't constrain them at all, then who cares if they're breaking its limits? But it was a good deal. And the irony is a second irony here, and that is that there is one, if you look at the treaty, if you look at the deal, the JCPOA, look at paragraph 36, which says if one country is not holding up its commitments, then another country can say that it's not bound by those commitments either. And, I'm not at all an apologist for the Iranian regime. If the regime were ended tomorrow, I'd be fine with that. And it's a hideously oppressive regime. But the first violator was President Trump, who withdrew from the deal for no reason except that he hated anything that had been signed by Barack Obama and that Netanyahu convinced him that it was worth getting out of. So he pulled out and then reimposed the sanctions on Iran and then imposed secondary sanctions against any country that's continued to do business with Iran. So Iran spends a year trying to convince the Europeans or the Chinese to figure out some way, maybe using some currency other than dollars, to continue trading with Iran. And then only after that didn't work did they start to enrich more uranium than the deal required. And they're trying to do this as leverage. Trump's idea was that he would he would exert maximum pressure to either to get Iran to come back and negotiate a quote-unquote better deal, or maybe to have the regime collapse under the pressure. Well, it didn't work. And now they have some leverage on us as well. I think that Biden has said that he would like to resume the deal, that it's in everybody's interest. The problem that's in place now is that both sides are outside of the deal. So who makes the first move? Iran is demanding, they say, if you come back into compliance, we will too. In other words, we have to lift the sanctions and then they'll get rid of the enriched uranium. We're saying, no, you have to come in compliance first and then we will. In other words, you get rid of the enriched uranium and then we'll lift the sanctions. Now, I think at some point some kind of formula will be worked out that makes that possible. But, one problem is that really within a couple of months, Iran is going to have enriched enough uranium to get very close to nuclear capacity. And also this June, there are presidential elections in Iran, and Trump's withdrawal from the accord really strengthened the more hardline elements within Iran. And I don't know who's going to be president in June, but it might be somebody who's much less interested in resuming any kind of deal with the United States. So it's something, if a formula is going to be worked out, maybe it can be worked out by a third party, somebody in the EU, say. It probably has to be done in the next couple of months. Otherwise, the deal might be something that can never be resumed, even though both sides, or at least certain parties in both sides, the current presidents of both sides, would like it to be. It's one of these things, and it certainly wouldn't be the first thing, but the first such event where just the politics of the situation, both domestic and international, make the satisfaction of rational interests on both sides, let's say, very, very difficult to meet.
All that's interesting. I think we've come all the way to present day, starting after World War II. A lot to think about. I do hope you'll leave us with one final anecdote here. I kind of saved it to the end, because to me it's particularly of interest. It ties national security, history to pop culture. And this is, I've told this story, but I won't do it as effectively as you could. This is when Ronald Reagan, I think it's 1983, views the Matthew Broderick film War Games.
Oh, yeah.
And is influenced, at least in part, by the movie to change some platform of American policy.
Well, I talked about this, but a book that I wrote before this book, I wrote it in 2016, called Dark Territory, The Secret History of Cyber War. The book begins with this story that in 1983, Ronald Reagan, he had been a Hollywood actor. It's well known that he watched a lot of movies while he was in office. And he was up at Camp David for a long holiday weekend. And one of the movies they watched was War Games. And it was a 1983 movie. You might recall that Matthew Broderick played this tech whiz high school kid who accidentally comes onto something that he thinks is a new computer game, but in fact he's accidentally, unwittingly hacked into the early warning computer of North American Air Defense Command. And he thinks that he's playing a game, but in fact he's on the verge of triggering World War III. So Reagan comes back to the White House. There's a meeting the following Wednesday, and it's about a lot of things. And there's a lot of people at this meeting. It's the Joint Chiefs, a bunch of cabinet, maybe about a dozen people from the Hill, because he's talking about the MX missile and the prospects for arms control talks with Russia. And then in the middle of it, he kind of puts down his index cards and he says, has anybody seen this movie War Games? And it had just come out the previous Friday. Nobody had seen it. So he launches into this quite extensive plot summary of and people are looking around like, what's this all about? And then he turns to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Vesey, and he says, General, could something like this really happen? Could just somebody break into one of our most sensitive computers? And the general says, I'll look into that, Mr. President. And he goes away, and he comes back about a week later, and he says, Mr. President, the problem is much worse than you think. And this led, again, back in 1983, to the first presidential directive on dealing with the vulnerability of computers. I mean, what we now know is cyber war, cyber defense, cyber vulnerability. So it just goes to show that sometimes the oddest things precipitate enormous shifts in policy. And maybe when Reagan was in power and when Gorbachev was that's another incredible confluence, that these two unlikely figures in their respective histories should be the leaders of their countries at the same time. Mm-hmm. Gorbachev he knew that the Soviet system was unraveling. It was falling apart. There was no money. He needed to reach out for Western investment. And to do that, he needed to convince the West that Russia was no longer a threat. And so he proposed very dramatic, very drastic things. I think that if a more conventional Republican or Democrat had been president, they wouldn't have leapt at these possibilities. They would have been much cagier, much more cautious, much more step-by-step. Reagan was a dramatic guy, too. The two of them, abolishing the entire class of intermediate-range missiles in Europe. That's an enormous thing. Again, at Reykjavik, almost agreeing to dismantle the entire nuclear arsenal. I mean, I can't imagine any other presidents doing this. So, again, there are interesting coincidences and convergences that pop up through history, and it's worth it. If you happen to be there when one of these happens, it's a very good idea to take advantage of it and to ride it for as far and as deep as you can go.
That's a great note to go out here on. I just want you to know, I told that story about war games to a group of soldiers on Fort Bragg last year.
So where the cyber thing is now, yeah.
Yeah, and I could tell they didn't know what I was talking about. They knew who Reagan was.
Reading my book.
Yeah, well, I mean, they knew who Reagan was, but Matthew Broderick was 21 when that movie came out. He's 54 or so now. I think it's maybe a generational thing.
Almost every hacker, almost every computer maven now grew up on that movie. I mean, some of them became hackers or counter-hackers because of that movie.
Yeah. It was the first movie I ever saw on HBO, and I think that was probably, the early days for HBO. But it was the first movie I think I ever saw without commercials that was not in a theater. It was the first movie.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating for me, Fred.
This was fun. It was a very good conversation. Thanks a lot for doing it.
Thanks so much for your time, and maybe we'll have you back on.
Oh, terrific. That'd be good. Thanks a lot.
Fred. Take care.
Okay,
We'll see you.
Bye.
That was Fred Kaplan. Deep discussion. We really got into things there with him. A lot of anecdotes, a lot of history, a lot of stories. The anecdotes are bizarre in some cases. The piece that he talked about with the Cuban Missile Crisis, that LBJ was unaware of the agreement we made to remove missiles from Turkey. That's something a lot of people don't know. And that's something that people don't know that influenced entry and buildup into the Vietnam War. A lot of these things are tied together, and it's just a fascinating history. A lot to think about there. He gave us a lot to consider. We appreciate his time. We appreciate your time. Thanks for continuing to listen to, download, tell others about the Doomsday Clock podcast. Please leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcast, and thanks so much for your continued support of the show.